In the last 2 weeks, Beijing interference in this country. I say it's Google interference now.
Hey there, welcome to About That. I'm Kieran Oudshoorn, sitting in for Andrew Chang today. Now, you just heard Conservative MP Kevin Waugh accusing Google of interfering with the democratic rights of Canadians. Why? Well, for the last 3 weeks, Google has been testing something. They've limited the access to news content for some Canadian users. And here's the thing, they didn't tell those users they were doing that. Now, Google says this testing is stopping today, but why were they doing it in the first place? Now, Google says that this was a test run for one potential response to Canadian legislation that was introduced last April, Bill C-18, also known as the Online News Act, and it would require digital giants to negotiate deals that would compensate Canadian media companies for things like linking to their content or sharing snippets or headlines.
Canadians should be concerned about the potential negative impacts on how they find and share news online. As the bill has worsened each step of the process, we've had to consider what product changes it may require.
Okay, but this bill doesn't just cover Google. Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, is also included. In other words, if your uncle links to a news article on his Facebook profile, Meta would potentially be charged for it. So today, we are going to look at the implications of this bill and try to understand the impact that it's going to have on those big internet companies and the people who use them to get most of their news. So, okay, on one hand, we have, large Canadian media companies like us, like the CBC, along with Torstar and Post Media. They've all come out in support of this bill, essentially saying that it would level the playing field for news outlets that compete with massive tech firms for ad dollars. But on the other side, of course, we have these big companies, Google and Meta. They are not thrilled about this bill. Here's what a Meta spokesperson had to say just this week about this. Quote, a legislative framework that compels us to pay for links or content that we do not post and which are not the reason the vast majority of people use our platform is neither sustainable nor workable. Now, the company says if this bill passes in its current form, it'll stop people from posting links to Canadian news outlets on its platform. Here's how Canada's Heritage Minister Pablo Rodriguez characterized that response.
Meta and Google, they all know that my door is always open. They have my cell phone. We met in the past. My team is talking to them on a regular basis. So I'm open to discussions, but I will not accept threats like that.
So potentially big implications here, right? But the thing is that this idea isn't really new. So to tell us a little bit more about that, we've reached out to Sue Gardner. She's an expert on web policy. She also ran CBC.ca in its earliest days. She's a special advisor to Wikimedia Foundation, and she wrote a critique of this bill titled Bill C-18 is bad for journalism and bad for Canada. Sue Gardner joins us now. Sue, thanks so much for being here.
Sure.
So I wanted to start off with Australia, because my understanding is that they've had a law that went into effect that was similar in some ways. Maybe you can walk us through how it's similar and how it's different to what's being proposed here in Canada.
Sure. I mean, they're very similar in that the fundamental kind of assertion behind both laws is the idea that by linking and providing snippets and summaries and headlines, social media companies and news aggregators and search engines are taking value from news publishers. So that's the fundamental premise behind both bills. And then so what Australia did was it proposed that the platforms would pay the news companies for the right to link to their material, but they would be exempted from having to come under the legislation if they could make deals with the companies ahead of time, which is what happened in Australia. So deals were made, and so no one was brought under the legislation.
Is this a win for Facebook, or is this a win for Australian media?
Well, right now, I think it's a win for Australian democracy.
Canada is essentially the same, except the exemption criteria in Canada are kind of a lot more complex than Australia. And so it will be harder for the digital platforms to get an exemption. So Canada is a little bit more complex, a little bit convoluted, but they're both rooted in the same premise.
So I want to come back to the exemptions in a minute, but I am curious if we can stick on this for a little bit longer. So we've had a little bit of runtime now that this bill has been in place in Australia, and that can give us some sort of perspective on what we might expect to see happen here in Canada. What are we seeing there?
The major difference between what happened in Australia and what's happening here is the intervening time between the two, right? I've been watching this for a while, and it looks pretty clear to me, like what I conclude is that if you look at Australia, the platforms were taken by surprise, right? Like they didn't expect laws like this to start to get passed. And so what we saw in Australia was Facebook, for example, kind of freaked out and took down all Australians' access to Australian news for about 3 days. And then they put it all back up. Google, I think, didn't know what to do and made deals with publishers. But in the intervening year, you know, the platforms have had time to reflect and to sort of think this through. And I think it's really clear from the reaction that we're seeing from the platforms in Canada that they have decided that this is an existential threat to them, that they are not going to comply with these kinds of laws, right? And sort of buy into this model that they need to compensate news publishers for their work. And I can talk more about that if you want, but I think we're seeing it in the last couple of days. Facebook has said that it is going to get out of the news business in Canada. And I mean, even before that, Facebook has been clearly making a strategic decision that news isn't in its interest. It doesn't really help its bottom line. In fact, it involves, like, it brings a lot of controversy onto the company, and people have lots of opinions about their hosting of news.
Canada hosted a committee of politicians from nearly a dozen countries, which got the chance to grill representatives from Facebook, Google, and Twitter about how they manage data, how they handle the spread of misinformation, and whether they're a potential threat to democracy.
So Facebook seems likely to be just getting as far away from the news business as it can, right? So rather than paying into a scheme like this, Facebook would rather just remove the ability for people to share Canadian news on its platform. Bad for Canada. And I think Google is also evaluating its options. You can see that with the testing that it's been doing here.
Yeah, and you can think about some places where Facebook is like a primary source for the people are using to share news. I know that I reported in the North for a long time. Everyone's on Facebook up there, and that's how they're sharing information. So you can sort of think about the trickle-down effects. I'm curious if maybe we can take a minute to talk about the exemption, because I know that broadly speaking, most of the legacy media, including CBC, has been pretty supportive of this bill. But there's a lot of smaller organizations that haven't been, and I think that's probably has to do with that exemption. Maybe you can talk us through what the issues they're raising has been.
Yeah, what's been interesting with the smaller companies, the sort of digital first media companies, is that almost all of them opposed C18 in the beginning, because what they saw it as doing was, you know, it was the result of lobbying efforts by newspapers, and it was always sort of clearly targeted towards legacy media organizations, right? Restoring the glory days when they could, you know, fund their operations through advertising. And so the digital companies looked at that and they thought, well, you know, we're competing with these guys in the marketplace, and we are not going to get the same, like, they're going to get bolstered, right? And then we will be, by contrast, disadvantaged.
Right.
And they've been saying that because they don't have the lobbying power and presence in Ottawa. They don't have the relationships with, for example, the CRTC, and they don't have people and lawyers, right? So when you imagine, you know, you're the Tyee or your, you know, Canada Land or your some small, you know, indie graph or whatever, some like a small organization, you don't have biz dev people to send to Silicon Valley. You don't have an army of lawyers to review agreements, right? So they have always thought that the very littlest ones would be pushed out entirely, right? That's been changed now. And I think an amendment has been put forward that would allow smaller operations, so like owner operated operations, to qualify for C18. But even with that, right, they don't have the negotiating strength, the negotiating power, even if they come together as a collective, that somebody like Forestar is going to have, you know?
Okay, so Sue, you know, a lot of people are raising criticisms about this. I understand that you have been a critic of this bill. I'm curious, what are some potential ways that we could be approaching this that would be maybe better from your position?
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, I am a huge critic of this bill, and I've been a reluctant critic because I acknowledge that Canada is in the middle of a financial crisis in the news industry, right? I've been out of the country for 15 years. Since I got back, it's obvious to me the Globe and Mail is a shadow of its former self. We have news deserts now. A lot of local places have no news at all for them, and that is a problem that needs to be solved. However, the government was handed a solution in 2017 when the Shattered Mirror report was released, which was from the Public Policy Forum, who'd been asked to investigate the state of news in this country. And what they argued for was the closing of a loophole in digital advertising revenues, which would have resulted in the flow into this country of a bunch of tax revenue. And the Shutter Mirror report argued that that tax money should be put into a journalism fund, which would be administered at arm's length from government. Nobody wants the government in the news business, but at the same time, nobody wants Google and Facebook in the business of making decisions about the Canadian news industry either. And if the federal government has policy objectives that it wants to achieve, like the funding of local or Indigenous news or investigative accountability-focused news, the right way to do that is through a fund administered at arm's length of government. So they've been handed that solution, and for whatever reason, I don't know why they've chosen to go this route instead.
Yeah. Well, there's obviously a lot that still needs to be worked out here, but we really appreciate you coming in to sort of give us your perspective. Thanks so much, Sue.
Thank you.